To discuss President Trump launching a probe into China's intellectual property practices. We're joined here in studio by Dan McClory, Managing Director for Boustead Securities. Dan, good to have you with us.
Thanks, Michelle.
So, Dan, the president launching a probe into China's trade, particularly intellectual property practices. How significant is this?
Well, I'd have to agree with the president. I think it's huge. You know, we've talked about a lot of topics, and this is actually a $1 trillion problem. It's estimated intellectual property theft is about $650 billion a year, just between the U.S. and China. And, you know, when you consider we have a trade deficit of about $350 billion, this is a problem with 4 commas in it.
Right.
And President Trump, quite rightly, is now taking some action, and we'll see what that leads to.
Well, a big part of the problem is that Chinese law requires that if an American company comes to the U.S., it can't come on its own. It needs to partner up with an existing Chinese company. And that, I believe, lends itself to the intellectual property being stolen or borrowed at the very least.
Right. You're putting it mildly, but yes, the forced conversion, the involuntary technology transfer that takes place when U.S. or international companies from any country, for that matter, go to China. And we've seen many examples of this. It's most particularly acute in the high-tech industries, but it happens in automotive. It happens in some of the basic manufacturing. So the problem, Michelle, is really the fact that China, not only do they not have a strict regime to enforce intellectual property, but even if you prevail, the awards for damages are minuscule compared to Western standards.
All right, so it certainly is something that is within Beijing's control, it sounds like, at least to take some steps. So why is China not exerting a more control over this, considering it's very problematic for the U.S. and the rest of the world?
Right. I think it's because they don't have to, or maybe until now they don't have to.
Right.
Let's face it, many companies from the U.S. and Europe that go over to China, they are somewhat fearful of saying the things that President Trump has said. They understand this goes on, but it's the market of 1 billion for consumers. It's too big to ignore. You've got to play by the rules, even though they're not happy about it. So I think, to President Trump's credit, he is saying the things that many of these tech CEOs in particular would like to say, but they have deemed it not conducive to their business interest.
All right, so they go along with it because they don't want to be cut out of that huge Chinese market, right, knowing, though, that it does hurt their business. Well, you've got you said President Trump in the U.S. is opposed to this, but the European Union, Japan, Germany, Canada, they've all expressed a lot of concern over China's behavior with regards to intellectual property. Do you see any kind of multilateral action?
You know, that's where Trump is, again, going off of the normal playbook. And those other nations that you talk about, whether it's the EU negotiating as a bloc or going through some other global outlets like the WTO, they've decided to stick to that route. Are they secretly wishing and wondering that they would take unilateral action like Trump is doing? Perhaps. Perhaps.
How complicated would it be to get the World Trade Organization to actually do something about this?
Yeah, it's a massive bureaucracy.
Right.
Whether or not Trump will be successful with what he's discussed and what he's announced, and remember, Michelle, he has just announced to Lighthizer that he should look into whether or not an investigation should be conducted. He really hasn't even launched the investigation. So let's see if an investigation takes place.
So it's very much a preliminary step into something. Is it enough, though, to provoke some kind of reaction from China?
I think so. Yeah, I think you will see it. It's now, they understand Trump's negotiating tactics. So, you know, have a blustery press conference, make all kinds of grand statements, and then try to use it as negotiating leverage. So the next time Trump is negotiating for something, it could be related or unrelated, maybe North Korea, who knows, they're going to have that in the back of their minds.
Well, is it a good time now to sort of provoke China, especially considering that the U.S. really does seem to need Beijing to try and rein in Pyongyang as the tensions there seem to be escalating?
Right. Now, I think it is. I think it's important that the U.S. acts now, and I really don't think it was a coincidence that China announced the banning of exports of some very serious commodities with North Korea. I mean, there's pressure coming from all angles. I think what we heard today about intellectual property, although it's a massive issue, I think it's designed to exert pressure.
Who are some of the companies that have most been hurt by the way that China handles intellectual property?
It's primarily the software companies. upwards of 70% of the software in use in China is pirated, for example.
Right.
So Microsoft comes to mind. You have a company like Google who had to move its servers out of China and into Hong Kong because they didn't want to have the theft of user data or the involuntary conversion of that user data. Intel, you know, inside the computers, they have, this is shown with the bipartisan support that there is for what President Trump did today, coming from the senators from Oregon, for example, where Intel is located. But those are three big ones that come to mind immediately. And
I'm sure those companies happy that some form of action is starting to take place. Dan?
Yes.
Thanks so much for joining us, Dan McClory. And you know, Dan, you just got back from London, right?
I sure did.
Did you see Big Ben?
Yes, I did.
Well, here's some news about Big Ben. The clock is ticking on it. Today's notable number is 4, and that's how many years Big Ben is going to be silenced for, starting next Monday. Work is set to begin on a bell tower repair project, and that work will continue through 2021. It's going to cost about $42 million. Now, Big Ben's hourly gongs have helped keep time in the British capital for 157 years. You're lucky. You got to hear it. Going to be a pause for 4 years. All right, stick around.